Live television is supposed to be predictable, controlled, safe, every word measured, every reaction rehearsed. But on that night, something broke through the screen. It started like any other interview: calm lights, soft applause, familiar faces. Viewers expected wisdom, not revelation; conversation, not confrontation. No one tuned in expecting a moment that would stop people mid-scroll, mid-breath, mid-belief. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly in his chair, hands folded, posture relaxed. No performance, no preaching, just presence. Across from him sat Morgan Freeman, legendary, thoughtful, composed. A man whose voice had narrated the mysteries of the universe, whose curiosity about faith had shaped decades of conversations, documentaries, and questions without easy answers. This was supposed to be a respectful exchange, two minds, two journeys, one stage. But then the host asked a simple question. Not controversial, not provocative, just honest. What has playing Jesus changed in you as a man? Jonathan didn't answer right away. That pause, just a few seconds, felt heavier than any speech. The audience waited. The cameras held. Something about his silence felt intentional, as if he wasn't choosing words but weighing truth. And then he spoke, quietly, carefully, without theatrics. What he said wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even long. But it landed like thunder. The atmosphere in the studio shifted, not emotionally at first, but spiritually. The kind of shift you don't see immediately, but feel. Conversations like this usually float on the surface. This one sank deep. Jonathan didn't talk about success. He didn't talk about fame. He didn't talk about the pressure of portraying Jesus on screen. Instead, he spoke about encounter. About what happens when faith stops being an idea and becomes personal. The cameras cut briefly to Morgan Freeman. And that's when viewers noticed something different. The familiar smile wasn't there anymore. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't nod politely. He didn't prepare a clever response. He listened. Really listened. Something about Jonathan's words cut through decades of intellectual distance, past documentaries, philosophies, debates, and definitions. This wasn't about theology. This wasn't about religion. This was about something far more uncomfortable and far more intimate. Truth. The audience felt it too. You could sense the stillness, the kind of silence that isn't awkward, it's reverent. No coughs, no movement. Just attention. Jonathan continued, his voice steady. He spoke about Jesus not as a historical figure or cultural symbol, but as someone alive, present, personal, not demanding perfection, only honesty. And then it happened. Morgan Freeman leaned forward slightly. A small movement, almost unnoticeable. But on live television, body language speaks louder than words. In that moment, the conversation stopped being an interview and became something else entirely. Not an argument, not a debate, a moment. Viewers at home felt it in their chests. Social media would later explode with comments like, "I don't know what that was, but it felt real." You could see something shift. That didn't feel scripted, and the most repeated reaction of all. I've never seen Morgan Freeman listen like that. Jonathan wasn't trying to convince anyone. He wasn't trying to convert. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply telling the truth, calmly, humbly, without pressure. And sometimes that's all it takes. Because when truth is spoken without force, without ego, without agenda, it has a way of finding the cracks people hide behind wisdom and success. No one in that studio knew it yet, but they were witnessing something rare. A moment that would outlive the broadcast. A sentence that would travel far beyond that stage. A conversation that would leave millions asking a question they hadn't asked themselves in years. What if knowing about Jesus isn't the same as knowing him? And that was only the beginning. Before that night, no one would have guessed a single conversation could carry such weight. Jonathan Roumie didn't arrive at the studio as a preacher. He arrived as an actor, humble, soft-spoken, almost uncomfortable with attention. To the world, he was the man who plays Jesus. But to himself, he was simply someone still walking the path of faith, still learning, still surrendering. Morgan Freeman, on the other hand, arrived as a legend, a voice trusted across generations, a mind respected across cultures, a man who had spent decades exploring God from every possible angle: documentaries, philosophies, ancient texts, modern interpretations. He had asked the biggest questions humanity could ask, and had learned to live comfortably without final answers. This wasn't their first time discussing faith. But it was the first time they were facing each other, not as symbols, not as roles, but as two human beings with very different journeys. Behind the scenes, producers expected elegance, depth, intellectual exchange, nothing more. The host introduced them warmly, smiling, unaware of what was quietly building beneath the surface. The audience applauded, phones ready, minds relaxed. No one leaned forward yet. No one sensed tension. It felt like any other thoughtful interview. Jonathan sat with his hands resting lightly on his knees, breathing slow, eyes grounded. He wasn't there to impress. He wasn't there to persuade. If anything, he looked like someone who would rather listen than speak. Morgan Freeman sat across from him, composed as ever, calm posture, measured presence. A man who had mastered the art of curiosity without vulnerability. His questions had always been safe, intelligent, distant, observational. The conversation began gently. They spoke about storytelling, about the power of myth, about why humanity has always searched for meaning. Morgan spoke eloquently, as expected. He talked about faith as something humanity creates in order to cope with mystery. He spoke of God as an idea that reflects human longing, beautiful, poetic, but distant. Jonathan listened closely, not waiting for his turn, not rehearsing a response, listening. The host then shifted the conversation slightly, just enough to open a door no one expected would be walked through. "Jonathan," the host asked, "you've portrayed Jesus for years now. Millions watch you every week. Has that changed how you see faith?" It sounded like a harmless question, but Jonathan knew it wasn't. He had been asked versions of it before at conventions, panels, interviews. Usually people wanted behind-the-scenes stories, preparation details, emotional challenges, acting techniques. That night he felt something different. Instead of answering quickly, he looked down for a moment, not from nerves but from reverence, as if he didn't want to answer lightly what had reshaped his life so deeply. What viewers didn't know was that Jonathan hadn't always been confident in faith. There were seasons of doubt, of silence, of unanswered prayers. Playing Jesus hadn't magically made belief easy. If anything, it made faith more demanding. It stripped away surface, level religion and forced him to confront something far more uncomfortable: surrender. Morgan watched him closely. This wasn't the behavior of an actor searching for words. This was someone choosing honesty over polish. Jonathan finally lifted his eyes, not to the host, but briefly to Morgan. That glance lasted less than a second. But it mattered, because it wasn't a glance of challenge. It was a glance of invitation. As the conversation continued, Jonathan spoke about responsibility, about the weight of portraying someone billions believe is not just a teacher, but truth itself. He talked about fear, the fear of misrepresenting love, mercy, humility. Morgan responded thoughtfully, but something in his tone began to change. His replies grew shorter, less rehearsed. His eyes stayed fixed on Jonathan longer than before. For the first time, the conversation wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Jonathan spoke about how portraying Jesus forced him to ask a question he had avoided most of his life. What if faith isn't about control but about trust? That sentence lingered in the air. Morgan shifted slightly in his chair. The audience didn't react, but the silence grew heavier. The host tried to keep things balanced, stepping in with lighter commentary, but it was clear something deeper had been unlocked. The studio lights felt warmer. The room felt smaller, intimate. Morgan leaned back, then forward again, as if recalibrating. "You know," he said slowly, "I've spent my life studying belief systems. But what you're describing doesn't sound like a system." Jonathan nodded gently. "Because it isn't," he replied. "It's a relationship." That word relationship hung between them. Morgan didn't respond right away. For a man known for his words, silence was rare. The cameras caught his expression, thoughtful, guarded, but curious. Not dismissive, not defensive. Curious, and curiosity, when it comes to faith, is dangerous. Because curiosity opens doors the mind alone cannot control. Jonathan wasn't pushing. He wasn't insisting. He was simply standing in his truth. The host sensed it too, the fragile balance of the moment. One wrong interruption could break it. So he stepped back, letting the conversation breathe. Viewers at home began to sense it as well. This wasn't about Christianity versus philosophy. This wasn't belief versus skepticism. This was about longing. About whether knowing everything is the same as knowing someone. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Morgan Freeman stopped speaking about God and began wandering toward him. What no one realized yet was that the sentence Jonathan was about to say next would take that quiet curiosity and turn it into a moment that would echo far beyond that studio. There are moments when a conversation reaches a crossroads. One path stays safe, intellectual, distant, comfortable. The other steps into something raw, something that can't be controlled once spoken. Jonathan Roumie stood at that crossroads. The studio was silent now, not because anyone demanded it, but because no one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. The host sat still. The audience barely moved. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate before cutting away. Morgan Freeman waited, not impatiently, not skeptically, but attentively. That alone was unusual. Jonathan took a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was calm, but there was a weight behind it now, like someone speaking from a place deeper than thought. You know, Jonathan said, I used to think faith was something I had to figure out. Morgan nodded slightly. I thought if I read enough, learned enough, questioned enough, eventually I'd arrive at certainty. He paused. But Jesus didn't meet me in my certainty. He met me in my exhaustion. The words landed softly, but they landed. Morgan's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, not in disagreement. In recognition, Jonathan continued. There was a moment in my life when I realized I knew about Jesus, but I didn't know him. And those are two very different things. The audience shifted. A quiet murmur rippled and died instantly. Everyone sensed it now, the shift from conversation to confrontation. Not confrontation with another person, but with the self. Morgan leaned back, folding his hands loosely. That's an interesting distinction, he said. Most people never separate the two. Jonathan nodded. Because separating them requires surrender, he replied. And surrender is terrifying. That word, terrifying, cracked something open. Morgan's voice, when he spoke again, was slower. Surrender to what? Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Morgan, not with intensity, not with persuasion, but with compassion. The kind that doesn't ask anything, but offers everything. To truth, Jonathan said quietly. To love. To the possibility that God isn't distant but personal. The room felt smaller. Morgan exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. You know, he said, I've spent years exploring religions around the world. They all describe paths, rules, practices. But what you're describing doesn't sound like any of that. Jonathan smiled faintly. Because Jesus didn't offer a path, he said. He offered himself. That sentence hit like a tremor. The host's eyes widened slightly. The audience froze again. Somewhere in the back, someone quietly whispered, "Row," without realizing their microphone was on. Morgan didn't respond right away. For the first time that night, the legendary voice, the one that had narrated gods and galaxies, had nothing ready. His fingers tightened slightly around each other. You're saying, Morgan began slowly, choosing each word, that faith isn't something we climb toward, but something that comes toward us. Jonathan's eyes softened. Yes, he said. Exactly that. A long pause followed. This was no longer an interview. It was a mirror. Morgan stared ahead for a moment, then looked back at Jonathan. And what if someone has spent their whole life studying God, but never letting God study them? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was vulnerable. The audience felt it. Viewers at home felt it. Social media would later replay this exact moment millions of times, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Jonathan didn't rush to fill the silence. That's not failure, he said gently. That's honesty. Morgan swallowed. And honesty, Jonathan continued, is all Jesus ever asks for. The tension in the room reached its peak. No music, no dramatic lighting, no cue cards, just truth sitting in the open. Morgan leaned forward now, elbows resting lightly on his knees. This wasn't the posture of debate. It was the posture of someone leaning in, not intellectually, but personally. So you believe, Morgan said, that Jesus is still inviting people? Jonathan nodded without hesitation. Every day, he said. Not to religion, not to performance, but to relationship. Morgan let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh, not mocking, but reflective. That would mean, he said, that belief isn't about proving God exists, but about responding if he does. Jonathan's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yes. The audience broke, not into applause, but into gasps. A few wiped eyes. The host looked down, visibly moved, unsure whether to interrupt or simply witness. Morgan sat back again, staring upward for a brief moment, as if searching the ceiling for words that weren't there. Then he said something no one expected. You know, I've narrated God. I've talked about God. I've analyzed God. He looked back at Jonathan. But I don't think I've ever asked God to speak to me. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Jonathan didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't claim victory. He simply said, maybe this is the moment you just did. And in that instant, the conflict resolved, not with an argument won, but with a heart opened. What happened next would ripple far beyond that studio. Because when curiosity becomes humility and knowledge bows to truth, something eternal begins. And that moment was only just unfolding. For several seconds after Jonathan's last words, no one moved. Not the host, not the audience, not even the cameras. Live television isn't supposed to pause like that. There are schedules to keep, producers in headsets counting seconds, cues flashing off screen. But none of that mattered now. The silence had taken control of the room. Morgan Freeman sat very still. His hands, once folded neatly, now rested open on his knees. His posture had changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The guarded composure he was known for had softened. His face carried an expression viewers rarely saw on him, not authority, not confidence, but reflection. The host finally cleared his throat, gently, almost apologetically. "Well," he said quietly, "this has turned into something far deeper than I think any of us expected." A few people in the audience nodded. Others wiped their eyes, embarrassed by tears they didn't plan to shed on a weeknight talk show. Jonathan Roumie remained silent. He wasn't waiting for praise. He wasn't waiting for affirmation. He was simply present. Morgan took a breath, then another. When he spoke again, his voice still carried its familiar gravity, but there was something new layered beneath it. A vulnerability that couldn't be rehearsed. "You know," Morgan said slowly, "I've always believed questions were more important than answers." Jonathan nodded. "But tonight," Morgan continued, "I feel like I've been handed a question I can't keep at arm's length." The audience leaned in collectively, as if pulled by the same invisible thread. "That's usually where truth begins," Jonathan replied. The host glanced offstage, unsure whether to steer the conversation back to safer ground or allow it to keep unfolding. Producers later admitted this was the moment they stopped trying to control the segment altogether. Sometimes, you don't interrupt moments like this. The camera panned across the audience. A young woman clasped her hands together tightly. An older man stared forward, eyes glassy. Someone in the second row quietly whispered, "Thank you, Jesus," without realizing they were being filmed. Morgan noticed it too. He glanced around the room, taking in the expressions, the stillness, the emotion. It seemed to surprise him, not the reaction itself, but the realization that words spoken without force could move people more deeply than any argument ever could. "I didn't expect this," Morgan said honestly. "Not tonight." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Neither did I." That admission landed gently but powerfully, because it reminded everyone watching that this wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. This wasn't a performance. It was happening. The host finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "Morgan," he asked carefully, "what are you feeling right now?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands again, flexed his fingers once, then looked back up. "Curious," he said, and strangely hopeful. The audience exhaled collectively, as if permission had just been granted to feel the same. Jonathan leaned back slightly, giving space. He didn't rush to explain. He didn't push the moment forward. He allowed it to breathe, a rare skill in a world addicted to noise. Behind the scenes, phones were already lighting up. Producers watched reel. Time engagement numbers climbed faster than anything they'd seen in months. Social media managers stared at screens in disbelief, as clips from the conversation began spreading before the interview had even ended. But inside the studio, none of that mattered. Morgan turned back to Jonathan one more time. "You know," he said quietly, "most conversations about faith feel like debates. Someone wins, someone loses." Jonathan nodded. "But this," Morgan continued, "feels like an invitation." Jonathan met his gaze. "That's all it's ever meant to be," he said. The host swallowed hard, visibly moved now. He glanced at the clock, then at the audience, then back at the guests. "We're going to take a short break," he said, almost reluctantly. "But I have a feeling people won't be going anywhere." As the show cut to commercial, the studio remained hushed. No chatter, no laughter, no restless movement. People sat in their seats, processing something they hadn't expected to carry home with them. Morgan leaned back, staring thoughtfully at the stage lights above. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, as if in quiet prayer, not showy, not obvious, just still. When the cameras returned, the mood hadn't changed. If anything, it had deepened. Viewers at home flooded the network's social pages with messages. "I don't know what I just watched, but I felt it. This is the most honest conversation about faith I've ever seen on TV. You could see something real happening." And the most repeated comment of all, "This didn't feel like television, it felt like truth." Morgan Freeman hadn't made a declaration. He hadn't announced belief. He hadn't crossed any visible line. But something had undeniably shifted. The armor of certainty had cracked. The distance of analysis had shortened. The door of curiosity had opened wider than ever before, and when curiosity meets humility, change is never far behind. What came next wouldn't just confirm that something had happened in that studio, it would show the world just how far one honest conversation can travel. When the cameras returned from commercial, something had undeniably changed. Not in the lighting, not in the set, but in the people. Morgan Freeman sat differently now. His shoulders were relaxed, his posture less guarded. The intellectual distance he had mastered for decades, the safe space where questions could exist without consequences, had narrowed. Jonathan Roumie noticed it immediately. He didn't acknowledge it out loud. He didn't draw attention to it. He simply stayed present. The host eased back into the conversation carefully, as if stepping onto sacred ground. "Morgan," he said gently, "earlier you said this felt like an invitation. Can you explain what you meant?" Morgan exhaled slowly. "I've always approached faith as an observer," he said. "I analyze it. I narrate it. I try to understand why people believe." He paused. "But tonight, for the first time, I feel like belief is looking back at me." The audience felt the weight of that sentence settle. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He didn't affirm or correct. He allowed Morgan to continue, because some realizations need room to speak themselves into existence. Morgan leaned forward slightly. "You know," he said, "I've played God. I've spoken as God. I've explored God." A soft ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. "But I've never considered what it would mean if God wasn't an idea, but a presence." Jonathan nodded once. "That question," he said, "is where faith stops being a concept and becomes a relationship." Morgan looked at him, eyes steady. "And relationships require response," he said. "Yes," Jonathan replied. "They do." The room felt impossibly quiet. This wasn't a debate anymore. This wasn't even dialogue. It was discernment. Morgan sat back, staring at the floor for a moment, then looked up again. "What if," he said slowly, "person isn't meant to solve God, but to encounter him?" Jonathan's voice was calm, almost tender. "Then all that's required," he said, "is openness." The host shifted in his seat, clearly moved but careful not to intrude. He sensed, as everyone did, that something deeply personal was unfolding in public. Morgan nodded to himself, almost imperceptibly. "I've always thought certainty was strength," he said. "But tonight, uncertainty feels more honest." Jonathan smiled softly. "Faith doesn't begin with certainty," he said. "It begins with humility." Another pause followed. Then Morgan asked a question no one expected. "What would it look like," he said, "for someone like me to respond?" Jonathan didn't hesitate, but he didn't dramatize either. "It wouldn't look like performance," he said. "It wouldn't look like announcements." He paused. "It would look like a quiet yes." The audience collectively held its breath. Morgan closed his eyes briefly. Not for long, not theatrically. Just long enough to feel the weight of the moment. When he opened them again, there was something different there. Not emotion, clarity. "I don't think belief happens in front of cameras," Morgan said. "But I do think moments like this remind us that something greater is always nearer than we think." Jonathan inclined his head respectfully. "That's often how Jesus works," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, just close. The host finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Morgan, would you say something has changed for you tonight?" Morgan considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said at last. Not in answers, but in direction. The audience erupted not into cheers, but into something quieter. Sustained applause, emotional applause. The kind that rises not from excitement, but from recognition. Jonathan didn't react. He simply sat still, hands folded, eyes lowered briefly, not in pride, not in triumph, but in gratitude. The moment passed without spectacle. No altar call, no dramatic declaration, no emotional manipulation, just honesty. And sometimes honesty is the most powerful turning point of all. Later that night, viewers would replay the segment again and again. Analysts would debate what had really happened. Comment sections would fill with arguments, affirmations, and disbelief. But those who watched closely knew better. They hadn't witnessed a conversion on live television. They had witnessed something rarer. A heart turning, a mind opening, a man allowing himself, just for a moment, to consider the possibility of encounter, and in the quiet economy of faith. That is everything, because turning points don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they arrive with a whisper, and that whisper, once heard, is impossible to forget. By the time the episode ended, the studio lights dimmed, but the moment didn't. It followed people home. Within minutes of the broadcast, clips began circulating online, not polished highlights, not promotional edits, Just raw, uncut segments filmed off television screens, shared with captions like, "Something real just happened. I don't know how to explain this." Watch Morgan Freeman's face. The algorithm did what it always does, but this time, it wasn't outrage driving engagement. It was stillness, curiosity, recognition. Millions watched, not because they were told to, but because they felt something pulling them in. Comment sections filled faster than anyone expected. Some were skeptical, some were emotional, some were searching. I've been asking the same questions for years. This didn't feel like religion. That conversation felt honest. And again, one phrase appeared. You could see the shift. Morgan Freeman didn't post a statement. Jonathan Roumie didn't celebrate. There were no victory laps. No headlines declaring conclusions that hadn't been spoken. And somehow, that restraint made the moment even louder. The following morning, interviewers began asking questions. Did something change? Was that a turning point? Was this planned? Morgan answered carefully, thoughtfully, as he always had. But his words carried a new tone. "I don't think faith is something you announce," he said in one follow-up interview. "I think it's something you sit with." Jonathan, when asked, said even less. "I didn't go there to change anyone," he explained. "I went there to be honest." That honesty became the most discussed part of the night. The absence of pressure, the absence of performance, the absence of ego. In a media world driven by noise, the quietness of the exchange stood out like a signal flare. Faith leaders weighed in. Philosophers debated it. Commentators tried to label it, but labels couldn't contain it. Because what people responded to wasn't theology, it was humility. Across the world, people began sharing their own stories under the clips. A teacher in Brazil wrote, "I've studied God my whole life." That sentence about relationship broke me. A college student in Germany commented, "I don't believe yet, but I want to ask better questions now." A man watching from Pakistan typed, "This felt peaceful, not aggressive, not forced." Late-night host joked about it gently. News outlets mentioned it briefly, but the real impact wasn't in headlines. It was in living rooms. People watched it alone. Couples rewatched it together. Parents sent it to children they hadn't talked to about faith in years. Pastors reported congregants bringing it up in conversations. Therapists mentioned clients referencing it, not as religion, but as a moment of vulnerability. And quietly, without fanfare, something else happened. Morgan Freeman began speaking differently, not about belief, not about conclusions, but about openness. In later appearances, he referenced the limits of analysis and the courage of not knowing, small phrases, easy to miss. But for those paying attention, they signaled movement, not resolution. Direction. Jonathan Roumie returned to his life as usual, filming, traveling, praying. But he received thousands of messages, from people who didn't feel judged, from people who didn't feel pressured, from people who finally felt safe asking questions again. He responded to very few. And that was the point. Because the power of that night wasn't in what followed publicly, but in what continued privately. Faith doesn't spread best through arguments. It spreads through authenticity. That single conversation reminded millions of something they'd forgotten. That belief doesn't begin with answers. It begins with honesty. And honesty has a way of traveling farther than intention ever could. Weeks later, the clip was still circulating. Still being discovered by people who hadn't seen it live. Still landing fresh. Because truth, when spoken gently, doesn't expire. It waits, and when someone is ready, it finds them. The world moved on as it always does. New headlines replaced old ones. Trends shifted. Attention wandered. But for those who watched that moment closely, something remained. A question, an invitation, a quiet nudge towards something deeper. And sometimes, that's all the aftermath faith needs. Because the loudest transformations don't announce themselves. They unfold. Not every transformation happens in a moment. Some don't arrive with confessions. Some don't end with declarations. Some don't fit neatly into headlines or hashtags. Some begin quietly, with a question. What the world witnessed that night wasn't a conversion stage for cameras. It wasn't a debate won or a belief defeated. It was something far more rare in modern culture. A man allowed himself to be open. In a world that celebrates certainty, vulnerability feels dangerous. We're taught to defend our positions, protect our intellect, and never admit we don't know. But faith has never grown best in certainty. It grows in humility. Jonathan Roumie didn't try to convince. He didn't pressure. He didn't perform. He simply spoke from truth, calmly, gently, without agenda. And that truth found its way past intellect into the heart. Morgan Freeman didn't suddenly become someone else. He didn't abandon curiosity or questions. But he did something many never dare to do. He allowed the possibility that knowing about God might not be the same as knowing God, and that realization alone can change everything. Because faith doesn't begin with having all the answers, it begins with asking the right questions. Questions like, what if God isn't distant? What if truth isn't an argument? What if belief isn't about control, but about trust? That night reminded millions watching that Jesus never forced belief. He invited relationship. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He stood close, waiting for honesty. And honesty, when met with grace, becomes powerful. The reason this moment resonated across cultures, ages, and beliefs wasn't because it proved anything. It resonated because it felt real. No manipulation, no judgment, no fear. Just two people meeting at the edge of something deeper. And maybe that's the lesson we've forgotten. Respect opens doors that arguments never will. Humility reaches hearts that force never can. Truth, when spoken softly, carries the greatest weight. Some people watching that night believed already. Some didn't. Some weren't sure what they believed anymore. But almost everyone felt the same thing. A pause. A stillness. A reminder that faith isn't about winning conversations. It's about loving people well enough to let truth do the work. And maybe that's where real change always begins. Not on stages, not on screens, but in quiet moments when a heart is finally willing to listen. If this story moved you, comment where you're watching from. Type JSOS if you believe humility is stronger than pride, or simply share this with someone who needs a reminder that faith can be gentle. Because you never know who's listening, and you never know whose heart is closer than it appears. Sometimes all it takes is one honest conversation